The Northwest Law and Mental Health Conference brings together expert speakers with legal, clinical, and lived experience to discuss the impact of the law on people with mental illness and addiction. Our spring 2020 conference was postponed due to COVID-19, so presenters recorded their sessions, which are now embedded in the conference website along with their collateral information. Thanks to all our expert presenters, generous sponsors, exhibitors, volunteers, and the planning committee for the Northwest Law and Mental Health Conference. Stay well, and we hope to see you in 2021. Hi, this is Jason Renaud again with the Northwest Law and Mental Health Conference, and today we're talking to Suzie Kuerschner, who's one of our area foremost authorities on fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Suzie, welcome.
Well, good morning, and thank you.
So, Suzie, you're going to walk us through what fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is, but mostly a very interesting new public policy idea you've been asked the American Bar Association to have a resolution on the disorder.
Yes. So actually it is, in fact, the resolution was first generated in 2012. It still is sort of rolling out at various rates and applications across the U.S. and but it's kind of its origin and its etiology really was first developed in Canada, and its kind of first iteration are looking at the relevance and the relationship between fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and justice, and the law, as I say, really found its beginnings in the territories of northern Canada, and which is sort of an interesting birthplace, but had some just incredible folks who were both public defenders, prosecutors, and judges that kind of first began looking at it and were then looking not only at what are the impacts of fetal alcohol within the context of justice, but how can we as systems better respond? So that kind of takes to why this first slide is entitled Engendering Hope and Delivering Promise, which actually I stole from an architect in terms of development from a community context, but it made me think of the fact that we do within our programs and systems, we do a lot, especially within education, justice, social work. We want to practice engendering hope, but what are those specific strategies that deliver promise? And so for me, so many of us were, looking at the context of FASD within the landscape of justice and realizing, the rates of recidivism, et cetera. And so the delivering promise really was that ability to strategize very specifically within that justice context in terms of what can we do from point of behavior through arrest, through interview, through courts, sentencing, certainly probation, aftercare, etc. And so there have been a lot of good people, and not just in North America, but there's much work that's been done in South Africa, Italy, several Ireland, New Zealand. So there have been a lot of good folks putting their heads together for this, and I am really grateful for the privilege to get to babble about it.
Well, great, Suzie. Are you ready to go to the first slide?
Sure. So the first slide really is entitled "The Opportunity," and that's how many of us choose to look at this is, rather the deficit than the deficits born of an FASD, but what is the opportunity of the justice system to that really is created by the Canadian Bar Association and the ABA resolutions, but what's that opportunity that allows us to really serve people strategically in a way that actually they're coming in contact with a justice system might be the first time in their lives when they really can have an opportunity to understand themselves and for others to be able to act on that opportunity. And so one of the things about getting to do this within the context of Multnomah County is that the ABA resolution does align with the Multnomah County Reentry Strategic Plan and certainly Senate Bill. And part of what we have had the privilege of doing is growing some of those strategic responses within the context of the Department of Community Justice, and specifically through the Family Service Unit, and working, doing a series of 12 weeks of trainings with probation officers within that service unit, and then following through doing technical assistance over the last 9 months, almost 12 months actually, with probation officers and their clients. So that kind of gives a backdrop or context of how it's living within Multnomah County.
Yeah, who you're talking to. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And again, I'm really grateful because I feel almost evangelical about this subject as it relates to justice, because I have, not only am I an old lady, but I've had the privilege of working within systems within Oregon and throughout the country, but then also, as I say, within Canada, and, found 15 years ago is probably when we started it in the territories, to a very, very responsive group of judges and attorneys, as I say, as well as public defenders, and also just a whole, criminal justice system response that followed through on actually, well, there's one other thing that I would like to give a tribute to, is that Judge Michael Marcus, I would like to pay tribute to him, because one of the probably biggest and most important kind of turns in my life that really allowed me to understand the potential of working within the context of justice was through him, probably almost 20 years ago now. And he was by far the first judge that was really responsive long before these resolutions, and very, very interested in doing anything that could be given to him as homework in understanding the impacts of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder from the context of behavior and the organicity of, brain expressions and through behavior. And I had the privilege of working through and designing a sentencing for a young man for whom it has, to this day, had a tremendous impact. That rather than being remanded through ballot measure 11, to be in a setting in which he would be shown behaviors that he wasn't going to benefit from. He actually was sentenced to a community placement with a trial judge that was a very, very positive and successful setting. So that I always like to give him a lot of credit for those early beginnings. So those are all of the things that support the opportunity slide. We could move on then. So moving from the idea of the opportunity, then we know from that we can grow positive community norms. And to do so, we also understand that part of the opportunity is that ability to collaborate with judges, lawyers, probation officers, child welfare, behavioral health, and all law enforcement folks in a way in which we're operating in concert with communities and with families. And then you'll notice from this slide that we also talk about natural helpers, which we might also understand as community health workers. So in other words, that collaborative way of working together, I think all folks with whom we have the privilege to work benefit from that collaborative support. But I think for this population that we're talking about in terms of being impacted by fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, it is particularly important to wrap around them in this way that creates a circle of care and creates that collective impact through systems working together, rather than, of course, as we all know, silos don't work for any of us, but particularly for this population. So then the next slide would be this, where we talk about what is the learning landscape, what are we learning here? And so some of the, central things that I'm hoping that today shares with you is the understanding of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder as an invisible lifelong disability. Also that we understand that prenatal exposure to alcohol is the leading cause of intellectual disabilities in the United States.
I didn't know that.
So that's a pretty important thing, because while it doesn't mean, that the logic from that does not follow that everyone, with an FASD has a diminished intellectual ability, but it does account for this population. And we will, further on today, we'll look at why we really need to, understand the spectrum as an invisible lifelong disability, because in the beginning days we used to think of it, we're looking for the faces. And so I'm really hopeful that today we get folks beyond that thought too. So today's presentations will offer some clinical research and evidence-based practice, and also some anecdotal stories that will inform, more promising practice-based evidence. And those, in fact, are, some of our best evidence of not only individual impact, strategic impact, but actually when within our communities we understand this, what it creates in terms of the safety and healing for all. Then the stories and strategies, they will reflect a relational approach which I think is really essential, that we meet people where they are. We have to use observation, and we have to do that over time and across in different settings, and be really mindful of identifying and taking the time to identify the strengths and the challenges that will inform this collaborative circle of services and integrated support. So always we're looking for that circle, and we know that the strategies that we are going to use to heal the challenges are going to be best born from the strengths of that individual and their community assets. Then another thing that I think is particularly important, and maybe a little less relevant, it might seem, from the context of justice, but not if we consider justice within child welfare, but we need to have our observation working for us so that we understand that early intervention provides, and we're not talking in terms of early intervention as it's used within the treatment community context, but rather really it as a discipline and as an international program that serves those early years, 0 to 3, 0 to 5, because when we do, we know that our observation and our strategies for addressing the needs early on provide powerful tools and really do mitigate the secondary characteristics. So that's really, as folks work with families and maybe, in fact, working with a mom who may be impacted, which has a lot of relevance to, what her choices in parenting will be. We know that we can really mitigate some of the impacts if she, in fact, did use with her child early on. And in many cases, there are a million anecdotal stories of working within the context of treatment and really helping these parents understand what their child needs, what are those good early interventions, and in so doing, what we have been told and collected data and anecdotal stories around is that, in fact, creating these tools and strategies for these parents have become their positive addictions.
Mm.
So it is a really relevant tool to parenting and skill building. So the next slide.
Okay, we're on the next slide.
Which is FAS and FASD. So what are they? They both are the consequence of prenatal exposure to alcohol. And something to insert here that we'll probably revisit, but I think it's important to know that what we think we know at this point, as in all disciplines, we think, we have a piece of knowledge until we learn something different. But at this point in time, what we think we know is that alcohol is the only substance that produces a lifelong consequence and disability.
Mm.
So that you will find that we zero in on prenatal exposure to alcohol, not because we are not mindful of the impacts, and especially early on of different drug exposures. Now, over time, we've learned that cocaine and crack, that our children seem to outgrow that. I feel less confident that we really understand and know all of the potential impacts of methamphetamines and a variety of other substances. But this is what we think we know so far. But I also think it's relevant and can be applicable to understanding what other drugs produce either short or longer term consequences for fetal development. But anyway, as far as FAS and FASD being fetal alcohol syndrome and FASD being fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, that what we most see and understand over time, over the last 40 years of knowing about the consequences, that those neurobehavioral expressions of alcohol as a teratogen are just have a huge impact across the lifespan. And then we also understand that there are morphologic, in other words, when I say let's look, people have looked at the faces. That's what we mean by morphology, is the physiology. Mm-hmm. Expressions of alcohol as this toxic poison or embryonic teratogen. So behavioral health issues, and moving on to the next slide, we understand that for adults impacted by an FASD, these issues create a disproportionate load on social service and justice resources. And when we have the privilege to participate in the lives of families and individuals, we are given the opportunity to help identify the strengths and the gifts of these individuals and these families and their communities and their culture. In other words, it's a holistic approach, as I was mentioning earlier, that's really going to be critical for fashioning the supportive strategies. So, but when we have this privilege, we are also charged with that responsibility to engage in an approach that simultaneously embraces clinical practice, but also cultural and community congruence. So what you might note through this presentation is much of this was grown and has been delivered within indigenous and native communities, in part because those were the first communities that were responsive to the identification of fetal alcohol. And so many of our early strategies grew that in that context. But also, I think that by looking through that sort of lens, then we can understand that for all peoples, whether it's a family context, it's a community, it's a neighborhood, it's a geographic, we all carry pieces of a cultural strength that can be used as a part of the approach. And studies demonstrate that best practice for effective strategies include those neuro and environmental trauma-informed FASD training and delivery with screening and assessment that will really help understand that we need to look. I mean, we have a lot of language around being trauma-informed, which is very important. But to be appropriately trauma-informed, we have to understand that we're looking at both neurotrauma and environmental trauma. And it's important to do that because if we just look at the folks that we're having the privilege to work with from the context of, oh my goodness, they have, had all of these traumas, or they have had all of these adverse life experiences, we need to be careful how we proceed with our, gleaning that knowledge and then the therapeutic responses, because to do so effectively, we have to understand the brains that we're working with and their concrete processing so that we do not risk re-traumatizing folks. We also know that as a basic principle that relational engagement with an individual is essential to be successful. And that's part of the strength-based approach, too, is that we're going to want, just very much as we do in our strategies that we build for young children and all, we also need to do with our adult populations with an FASD to really map what they are doing and helping them script what is working for them, what is the positive map that we can, really to help to reinforce. So then the next slide is, recognizing and knowing the signs of an FASD and how are they expressed through a lot of the behaviors. So I think it's important from, the landscape of justice to look at those things that are a part of an FASD that may in fact, impact what's the relationship, with law, justice, etc. So perseveration, gullibility,
Suzie,
poor judgment.
Tell us what say that again.
Oh, perseveration? Yeah,
describe that for me.
It's one of my favorite words. Because to perseverate means that we get stuck in something and we do it over and over. An example might be if I have, and it could be from an FASD, from a variety of things, but I might get stuck in starting a sentence or telling the story, and I just if anything stops me, I get hooked up in that same place.
Oh.
If I've found a behavior that works for me, I will tell the same story. One of the things that I found with one of the clients that I had the privilege of working with in one of the prison settings was that she had an FASD. We helped her be diagnosed. One of her expressions was that she really needed to be have space around her and be more isolate. So clearly, the time dorm coming living was not a positive experience for her. So what she figured out is when she got in trouble and she was put in SEG, that was the best place for her to be. What she learned to do and perseverated on, that if she had a particular encounter with a particular guard, it will always send her to SEG. So you could look at perseveration as being stuck in a variety of ways. And it could also, many people with an FASD or brain-based behavior show that perseveration. They do things over and over as a survival skill.
Susie, that rings a
So
bell
we
for
can understand.
every one of my
Go ahead.
clients. That just rings a lot of bells there.
Well, I suspect it does. And then the other thing you might notice is that there is a self-stimming that can go along with that. And what we mean by self-stimming is doing that repetitive behavior of tapping a pencil, you know, jiggling the leg.
Yep.
Those are all the things that those are going to calm my central nervous system.
Yeah. Somatic coping. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. You got it.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking the question, and please do that, because that'll make this all work much better, hopefully.
We got one more down the line a little bit.
Okay, we'll get there. Okay. Gullibility. In other words, I'm going to be really gullible. And what you show me is what I believe. And especially if you make me feel like I'm important, I'm going to be easily led to do whatever. Poor judgment. If the impact of a fetal alcohol means poor frontal lobe, well, we know that's going to express it through poor judgment. Impulsiveness, that just, I'm in the moment. I'm not going to pre-plan. I'm just in the moment. I'm going to react, both sensorially and, concretely in terms of my processing. Which that leads me into my inability to link or predict cause and effect. Don't tell me why, don't ask me why I keep doing the same thing over and over. Every moment is a new moment. Is that ringing a bell?
That rings a bell.
Inability to identify dangerous situations, which is very much, kind of related to that. So lack of boundaries, but just, I don't, and if I can't generalize, I might have learned it in one dangerous situation, but that has nothing to do with another. And we'll go into all of these things more as as we go further into the PowerPoint. But the inability to anticipate, these are all related to the inability to link cause and effect, but the inability to anticipate and understand consequences. So, how many of our folks have had multiple arrests for the similar crimes? If I have an FASD, I am quite likely more able to be expressive in my language skills than I am to be in my receptive, which is to say my expressive are like what I'm doing right now. I can talk. And I can talk probably echoing what people have told me or showed me that I'm supposed to say. Now, my receptive language is that processing piece, that comprehension piece. And if I have an FASD, that does not work well for me. And then there is the literal concrete thinking and misinterpretation, all of the nuances and innuendos, that's all goes, if I have an FASD, that goes right by me. And then I have this thing that we call behavioral echolalia, and we'll go into that more within the course of this PowerPoint too. But that, whatever environment you put me in, that's who I'll be. And that was the incredible beauty of Judge Michael Marcus, because he saw that and he designed, a sentencing structure that spoke to that.
He saw that echolalia presentation of his people in his court.
Yes, and then where he was going to benefit, most. Who's going to be around you? You put me in the midst of good people, and that's who I'll be. You put me in people who have challenges and adverse behaviors. That's who I'm going to be. Mm. So it has huge implications, and I have a million stories. As I say, I feel evangelical sometimes. I'm sorry, forgive me. But I have had the privilege of so many folks for whom they had repetitive behaviors and arrests and incarcerations from, like, this one young man from 13 to 30. And once we had him diagnosed and helped him understand himself, and he was put into community sentencing with very, very concrete structures. We are now 15 years out without any arrests, any non-compliance. The only thing that he begs for and drives in terms of compliance is that we all stay in his life enough to chuck in. And even one of his judges, this was in the north, he flies once a month from Vancouver to the Yukon Territory to take the guy out to hamburgers just to, support him. So, but this is a person for whom his whole history suggested that he would never, and there were many who just said, just keep him locked up. And so he is a huge demonstration of understanding those principles of behavioral echolalia. And then so does this, if we were to go further into that case, we would understand the sensorial reactiveness that creates the explosive behaviors and also the sexually aberrant behaviors, many of them. Now, there's a case right now, a public case that we probably is not appropriate to talk about, but some of us are raising the question of why does this person keep cycling through the system? And we are making, I called probably 2 arrests into it and saying, he needs a diagnosis and he needs a different strategy. But anyway, moving on to the last one. Was this one that you were interested in?
Confabulation. You bet. Tell me about
isn't that a lovely word?
It is.
It's a euphemistic way of saying lying.
Well,
but
there's a part of confabulation where the person knows 2 facts and just needs to get from here to there.
You got it. So I don't need to teach you anything.
Tell me how it works in the context of FASD, though.
Okay, so taking and looking at these other earlier principles, if I have an FASD, my story is going to reflect what you show me. Not only am I in my environment, but your body language, your face, what in that moment is being shown and that I'm thinking about, I am going to tell you the story that you are showing me I need to tell you.
Mm-hmm. Wow, so that's really...
This is not pre-planned.
Yeah, okay.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Feels what?
It feels, from a layperson's perspective, just conniving. There's a sort of a evil aspect to that.
It is, and that's a very, thank you so much for bringing that up, because unfortunately for so many of our folks, that is exactly how people respond, and I understand why, but it looks like manipulation, it looks like conniving, and no, actually what they're doing is they are reading the environment of the moment, and they are giving feedback from that context. And that's why the story will change from time to time. This is also works in a very adverse way for our folks, with an FASD who admit to crimes that they didn't do. So that's another part of our work, is working within the context of those projects too. Mm-hmm. Because, and we have some pretty notable national ones that involve those folks. So, moving on to the next slide, then all of this is sort of begin with the idea that involvement in legal issues may very likely be the first opportunity, as I said in that earlier story, to generate assessment and the diagnosis of fetal alcohol so that we can begin. That might be the very first time in their lives that a person has an understanding of who they are, what their strengths and abilities are, and what kind of structures can move them forward into positive lifestyles. So that becomes the really important piece of diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
So again, to the next slide then is to sort of revisit that neurobehavioral consequence is, looking at the impact of alcohol and understanding that it is most manifest within the structure and function of the brain. And that we will look at that neurocognitive and behavioral consequence as it creates the most devastating impacts across the lifespan, as I was saying earlier. So even though we know that there's that morphologic or physical piece that contributes to, facial characteristics, may have to do with skeletal structures, it may have very likely and often does have an impact on organ development of the heart, have kidneys, renal systems, etc. But in terms of what, this particular, our system of justice and the behaviors that it, addresses, this is the primary consequence. And I would actually say that because of that devastating impact, behaviorally, that really is what pushes people into poor health too, because of the addictions to self-regulate that are created by fetal alcohol. Then it certainly pushes physical health issues even more. So if I have a damaged heart, then I certainly am not going to benefit from the use of alcohol and other drugs. Mm-hmm. If I have compromised renal, kidney, etc. systems, I'm going to be hopeful that people realize the difference between ADHD and that I'm not being given some of those medications. So we do want to understand, and there's certainly, many slides, many trains around that, but kind of are spending our focus today and really wanting to look at those neurobehavioral consequences. So if we move to the next slide, looking at domains of impact, mm-hmm. Then again, we'll look at that first. What's adaptive behavior? Well, that says, how do I fit in with my social skills, with my communication skills? Can I go from one setting to another? For instance, in our kids, within the landscape of schools and academics, we know that our kids with an FASD have a really hard time moving from one activity to another. So let's understand that's application and implications for an adult. We know that, as we mentioned it earlier, that's going to really impact my ability to have a good intention, and that I may have impulsivity and hyperactivity. I know that in terms of cognition, cognitively, it's going to be really challenging for me to understand abstracts. And sequential thinking, I can learn if you set it out for me. These are the things we do. We spend a lot of attention and early intervention doing those kinds of sequential tasks, and we still can work with adults with that, but it's a challenge if no one is giving me any of those strategies or interventions. Again, to look at language as a domain of impact, we understand that the processing, again, as I said, the receptive, are the challenges, and the expressive skills are what I'm good at, and that's why everybody goes, well, if you tried, you're perfectly smart. I'm listening to you talk. You're perfectly smart. If you wanted to, you could do this. Yeah. Another really important domain of impact for behavior is memory, encoding, retrieval, working memory. Positive behavior is really built on a good working memory, and if I don't have it, again, I'm going to be reacting to what's right around me. For motor skills, my coordination, my balance, all of those things are challenging. So again, to think about, yes, this is a neurobehavioral consequence, But we also have these other things that if I have an FASD, life just feels really hard and frustrating because motorically I might be challenged. My sensory integration, my ability to have that visual, spatial, motor learning, it's really challenged. And it can be really set off because if you've got me in an environment where the lights are too bright, excuse me, or the sounds are too loud, or the smells, you know, you've got me in a meeting room, excuse me, or an office that has a off-gassing, you know, toxic synthetic rug, that's going to set me off, and I don't know why. It makes my head hurts or whatever. I don't know why I'm uncomfortable, but I am. Then my social skills, my social perception, you know, boundaries and all, those are really impacted. I had a client this week tell me, she goes, in some ways the social distancing is like the world finally is doing what I wanted.
All us introverts. Yeah.
Uh-huh. So that's, you know, there are a number of things I've learned from clients this week that have been really pretty interesting. One of them being that mapping of the positive. This one woman said, she said, you know, and she's been doing really well for about 6 months, and she said, you know, I just feel like I love how the news is in our shelter now. And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, when you turn on the news, there are all these stories of what people are doing to be kind and to be helpful to people instead of turning into what everybody's doing wrong. And so she was really reflecting that she felt like, she goes, I look around and I hear all of this that everybody's doing to be kind and generous, and I feel like I'd be a schmuck if I'm not. So much to be learned right now.
Yeah.
And then those executive skills are what we're meaning, that judgment and reasoning, you know, impulse control that we talked about, that with a frontal lobe that isn't allowed to totally develop because of the consequence of the toxin of alcohol, then I'm really challenged with an FASD. All of which is to say, throughout this, the other thread I hope that weaves itself through is that with good, scripted, concrete strategies, there is so much that we can do, and our brain is a phenomenal organ, and so we can teach other parts of it. So this is not to be taken as the, you know, the gloom and doom story, but rather, again, engendering that hope through delivering specific strategies. Another thing, the next slide says understanding what it does and does not mean. And again, that revisits looking and understanding intellectual disabilities as being a part of, but not always present. So it is really important, and particularly in working, I think, with clients and with service providers, to not look at it as something about being smart or stupid, as this one client said. But it really is that organic brain damage that creates different ways of learning and seeing and processing. And another thing for this basic, you know, sort of landscape of understanding is the next slide, looking at expressions and implications. So when we say confounding comorbidities, what else is going along with it? I mean, as human beings, we are never our diagnosis or any, you know, any particular identifier. We are the unique combinations of those all, you know, all of those identities. Well, even within our neurologic challenges, we probably have some other things, especially if I'm an adult with an FASD, I'm going to very likely present with some other diagnoses within the DSM-5. So now it might be that I might be in concern. ASD is autism spectrum disorder. And so it might be sometimes with an FASD, we have clients with whom Both occurs. And when we do, sometimes we see the most explosive and some of the most aberrant behaviors when those two collide. And that's worthy of a whole discussion and training of itself, but I would like to put that out there as an understanding that both can be occurring. And there are a variety of things that we are wondering about in terms of father and mom's impacts together. And but always with autism, we know that there is that genetic predisposition that will have needed to be in place, you know, to push that consequence. But it can certainly collide with and present with an FASD. I also, as a child or as an adult, I may be observed and understood as having ADHD, and I may also have it. I may also not. So it's going to be really important for that to be explored. Anxiety disorder often shows up among the folks that we serve within the context of justice, and that may very likely be a secondary characteristic of an FASD. The bipolar issues and depression very much express themselves as secondary characteristics within fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So we need to be mindful of those as being symptomatic, very much like there are many of us over the years in working within education who talk about oppositional defiant disorder, and you know, I mean, it has its own diagnosis, and that, but what we present as the case is that that's really a secondary characteristic, is that, which is that explosive behavior that is a consequence of unstrategized, without intervention and mitigation that appear in those settings. So the next slide, the potential impacts of an FASD.
Got it.
And this is kind of just, I mean, it's a bit linear, but it actually, my point in creating this slide was to look from the positive to what can be the consequences and negatives. So presuming that I have no intervention, as a small child, I might begin and present by looking helpful and caring, because I'm in my kindergarten class or my preschool class, and I want to help the teacher because I want to be close to somebody who looks like they care about me. And so I'm really observed as helpful and caring. And as I grow, I show really good artistic ability. And I really do echo what's around me so I could become a really good musician, and will often have perfect pitch. I am a visual learner, so show me, show me, show me. Don't tell me, show me. I like people, especially if they're nice to me, but I can get into trouble, therefore. It's really hard to sit still, and it's really hard to listen and understand. I want to please, but then I have some friends, and I got in trouble with the law. And then, to make myself better, I kind of got into using substances. And then I got caught up in violence. And I feel like a complete failure. I can't hold a job. I have to keep moving. And I have no way to support myself, so I'm homeless. Nobody wants to be around me. I feel really depressed. I have poor judgment. I feel hopeless. So I account for probably 60 times the use of drugs like methamphetamines that make me feel powerful for the first time, and I'm immediately addicted. Or that isn't what regulates me, and I use other things or not, and I become so hopeless that the statistics for suicide within FASD are at least 16 times. So that's sort of the potential impacts from good to, really, really sad. So let's kind of go back and then to the go to the next slide and start picking up, like, well, what are they? What are these things, and going in further into what is the brain of a person with an FASD, such that those potential impacts without intervention and positive strategies go from that helpful, caring, person who wants to be liked to the person who is hopeless. So going to the next slide, then we can look at FASD. It hijacks the brain, midbrain. Well, what's the midbrain? Those are emotions, And what happens is that given the brain structure of a person with an FASD, that is not well connected. My limbic system, which is part of my emotional regulatory system, it's on a roller coaster. I feel really great at 10 o'clock in the morning, and you say, and I say, I'm fine, I'm great, everything's great. And you go, well, how's your day? It's great. And then I talk to you at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'm filled with all kinds of negative self-talk and destructive language towards myself and others, and I hate life, and I just give up, and I'm going to, find the first substance or activity that is going to make me either feel better or I'm going to give up. And this is why, if we look at incidents of suicide, we realize that, just like everything else for this population, things are not pre-planned. They are what are happening in the moment. And so that's that roller coaster. My brain, it doesn't retrieve what isn't stored. So I don't have a nice filing cabinet in my brain. But everything's always scattered. Unless you are giving me all kinds of good strategies and interventions to start first building the file in the part of the brain that's going to be most competent for me, and then showing me how to store it in a concrete way and showing me how to retrieve it visually. So the next slide, which is need external scaffolding structure, I really need someone to help me build that scaffolding and to hold that in place for me.
That sounds like this
Without it, I can't be successful, and I will be stressed. Pardon me?
This seems like the work to be done here.
It is, exactly. That's the delivering the promise. Thank you. So let's take another look at secondary characteristics, okay?
Okay.
And those are the things that have happened if I haven't had help. So that next slide, you look on the left and you see feelings of failure. Mm-hmm. Without intervention and good strategies, they will grow into feelings of depression, mental health, and substance issues. My frustration in communication, where I feel like I can talk and people tell me I'm perfectly smart, but I'm not really processing and understanding what they're saying. Without intervention, those will turn into, and when I'm young, tantrums, although those tantrums, we have plenty of adult ones, or that oppositional defiant disorder. I may have challenges and difficulties in processing and memory and cognition, and without strategies and interventions, then I will have school and ultimately job failures. My impulsivity and reactivity to things puts me in situations where, again, those explosive behaviors, those reactionary behaviors, that doing whatever anyone tells me because I just please want somebody to like me, gets me involved in legal issues and involvement in corrections. That basic need for social and physical reinforcement, if it's not given to me, those may very likely express themselves through inappropriate and aberrant sexual behaviors.
Mm.
And we have to understand that there is a whole cohort of folks who present as with sexual behavior that actually account for those folks for whom we can change that behavior if we understand who they are. Within our field of looking at fetal alcohol, we often call them perpetrators of opportunity. And we have to look at the sensorial stuff. We have to look at the very immature, developmentally delayed responses to life that put them in really unsafe situations with people who are not their chronologic peers, but are their developmental. So again, an anecdotal story that would sort of highlight, which is not to say this is what all the stories are, because as I say, there are many, many reasons for why that inappropriate sexual behavior expresses it is so often expressed within this population. If we did not, if we have not done good intervention and strategic planning when they're young, which if we do that, it doesn't express itself. But when we don't, it does. But one of the stories that I would tell is of a man who multiple times in front of the judge for many, many things. Most often in his adolescence and young adulthood, it was because he was doing things because someone said, do this, do that. He was, he would really, do whatever was asked of him in the way of getting drugs for folks, acting out in particular ways, etc. He was just always, if you stood back, you could see that so much of his behavior was his attempt to try to find some kind of relationship because he had none with his family, and basically had been on the streets until his early 30s. And then he had fallen into a relationship with a young woman, and it was, she was underage. So here he was in front of the same judge that he'd been in front of before, and the judge asked the person, are you aware that it is against the law? You cannot have sex with somebody who is under 18. And this young man, who at that point was 31, said, well, yes, of course, I understand that. And then the judge said, but, and using his name, he said, but you did. This young woman is 13. And he put his hands, I was in the courtroom because I was assisting with the case, he put his hands on his hips. And he said, Judge, I always thought you were a really smart man, but now I'm thinking not so much. And the judge said, well, why do you think that? And he said, okay, you tell me who's older, the person who can read or cannot. I don't know how to read. My girlfriend is teaching me to read from Hooked on Phonics. Now you tell me, who is the older person?
Oh, no.
And that became an international case because it's so well expressed, what is really askew in reasoning, thinking, etc. He also is somebody who has become very successful and is an incredible artist. Successful in that, but that so terrorized him that he is, to this day, asked to be in a supportive living situation. The only support he wanted was that he wanted to know that he would have to be in by dark. So we have a landscape littered with good, challenging, not so challenging, but really good and positive stories, as well as the landscape of, tragedy. So there's just sort of put that in people's thinking in the process too. So I think there's so much more that we could be doing for the population in this particular, area of behavior. And for everyone else's safety. Because it's all, at the end of the day, all of this is about accountability. This is not used for anything. It's and it definitely is not an excuse for us as providers. To me, it serves for an understanding to create the kind of accountability within individuals, families, and communities that makes us all better off, because we're all better off. We're all safer when we do it. So that's my little diatribe right there. So then moving to the next, which kind of touches that last discussion that we had about inappropriate sexual behaviors, is it's really important to understand those impacts, those sensorial, those processing, and those self-regulation. Because as human beings, for all of us, the ability to self-regulate, anyone who works in infant or early childhood care really understands that's a really important thing to help a child reach, is an understanding of self-regulation and what contributes to it. I also feel that as I work within justice, that has become such an important piece, and we do so many things now around providing those same kinds of sensorial materials within the offices of probation officers, et cetera, that make a huge difference. Having a sheepskin on a chair that they can run their hands through, a basket with little stones to put their hands through, that need for self-stimulation, for self-regulation that can really calm that central nervous system that is so on edge and is a lifelong, challenge of an expression of FASD. So again, moving to the next slide and looking at FASD as it expresses within the context of justice. Well, guess what? These folks we're talking about, what do? We see the increases in the rates of recidivism. We see the increases in vulnerability to victimization. We see the vulnerability to becoming an offender or perpetrator. And we look, as we just discussed, the rates of sexual abuse as they relate to FASD. So some statistics: out of 415 adolescents involved with the law, 60% were screened and diagnosed with FASD. In a sampling of adult prison populations in which screening and a diagnosis for FASD occurred, 87 to 90% of the inmates received an FASD diagnosis. Now that really varies because it's also down to 15 to 20 depending. And so since made this slide, I feel like it's important to say it's a wide range. And sometimes it makes us wonder, if you were to step back and really look at those studies, where is this happening and why is it what are the sort of subset demographics? But what we do know, what I think we can quite be assured of, is that we have a huge, huge population impacted. And a lot of folks who are in settings such as Coffee Creek, who when we go in and do these, sort of awareness trainings and interviews and assessments with clients. Many are self-identifying, and in many cases they will speak to their, mother being deceased from alcoholism. So I think we need to really look and understand that correlation. In a collected set of studies of North American indigenous peoples, it appears approximately 57 to 80% of adults incarcerated and that received assessment and diagnosis were identified as having an FASD. So that's one of those subset, demographics or populations. In terms of added costs and social services, approximately 2.5 to 4.5. Again, kind of reflecting different geographic areas. $1 million per individual with an FASD. So, if we just want to look at our pockets, and they're even more around justice, you know that we could redistribute those dollars for intervention and for positive supportive strategies much better. So again, to just sort of go through kind of quickly the key principles and moving from, some of the slides that I showed you to really when we did the panel for SAMHSA, these were kind of what we wanted to identify for folks in justice as the major impacts, creating rates of recidivism and challenges within this system, is that lack of impulse control, the next slide, lack of impulse control and trouble understanding the future consequences of behavior, so that cause and effect. Then the next slide, trouble understanding what constitutes criminal behavior. For instance, and this is a real example that we used, is a youth with an FASD may not see any problem driving a car that he knows was stolen if it wasn't the one who stole it. You know, and actually, since we did this slide years ago, there's a current situation of an adult who actually is exactly a woman who is like, and this is like the third time, you know, being arrested for the same thing, and every time she goes, well, but I'm just a passenger. The next slide is difficulty planning, connecting cause and effect, or empathizing. In other words, really understanding it, and particularly if the experience is not explained in a very concrete way. So that ability, it really diminishes the ability to take responsibility or delay gratification or making good judgment, because again, with an FASD, I am in the moment, it is now, and I need that responded to in this moment at this time. The next slide, tendency towards explosive episodes that we referred to, which is they often are triggered by sensory overload, whether, as I mentioned before, it's the lights, it's the smells, it's the people moving too close to my space. I mean, you know, we have had incidents happen in grocery stores where people just were in their space and they just exploded, and it would seem to anybody who was a bystander, no, they must be on something. Why were they doing this? And sometimes they are, but sometimes they're not. And those slower rates of processing the information makes them feel stupid and reactive. Excuse me. Then the next slide speaks to the vulnerability that we mentioned before. So to that vulnerability to peer pressure and to influence. As I mentioned before, that I'm going to do something just to please my friends because I really want friends. And you suggest something to me and I'll do it. With an FASD, the next slide is, you know, I typically will have a lower level of moral maturity. In part, it's because of my inability to process, you know, social cues around me. And so again, some of this is a combination of developmental delays that may be specific to language and social settings, and that those processing. They might be because I am always feeling, you know, I'm having to find my way through a whole lot of information in terms of that sensory overload. And so quite literally, what is being asked of me is much more than the regular person, because I'm having to decode and find my way through all of those challenges. And then, as we mentioned before, the next slide is like, look at the expressions of those other things, like autism that might be co-occurring. And then if we put, the next one is a justice, is actually a judge from up north who made the statement shortly before the Canadian Bar Association resolution was developed, and what he stated was that putting individuals with FASD in jail is sort of a Band-Aid on an open wound sometimes, and the wound is always going to be open, but I guess a more successful approach would be to make the wound non-inhibiting. So something that's peripheral to their life in the sense that they can find a way to live in despite of it and a way to function in despite of it, which is one way of putting it. And another is a more strength-based or coupled with that, because I think it's well said, but part of what then we develop from that is, okay, what are those strengths that literally can be used? So, for instance, in one of the cases that I had described in my storytelling is this young man, as he sat in court and heard but couldn't process some of what was happening, was drawing a picture of me because I was next to him. And at the end of the court proceeding, I looked at it and I was kind of alarmed. First of all, I didn't find it I might have wanted it to be more flattering, but it was the most realistic picture of me than anyone I'd ever seen drawn. And I said to him, I said, "Oh my goodness, you're an artist." And he goes, "I'm not an artist." I said, "Well, you certainly are." And he said, "Why do you say that?" And I said, "Because I've never seen anyone draw something quite that realistic, and just your ability with your just, fine lines to express a person is incredible." And he said, "Oh," he goes, "Well, he goes, I like to look at things. I really don't like to listen to people because it never makes any sense. But, he goes, I heard that a long time ago that there's 360 muscles in a face. And so if you just watch each of those muscles while you were talking today, I just was watching your muscles. And so I just drew it." And so it's like, well, this is pretty astounding. So what we ended up doing, because this was another northern setting where we could use, a community strength assessment, we realized that we had elders who didn't like their pictures taken in different communities, indigenous communities. So part of his sentence was with a support of a community health worker, natural helpers, go around to the communities, and it took 5 years to do all of those. But he drew all of those elders, and out of that, then that created relationship for him and became, that very supportive accountability kind of, court-ordered activity that really helped him grow and create a different sense of himself. As I say, sometimes in communities like that, we have more latitude to do those kinds of things, but I think part of what we're learning from within the context of the Department of Community Justice project that we're doing here in Multnomah County is that we can find that here too. And so when I keep hitting things like music, art, those kind of visual arts, weaving, beadwork, there are many things that we can weave into as a part of that approach, and there is, within the resolution itself, there are many places that is identified and highlighted. So, at the end of the day, I am a teacher, an old teacher, an educator, and so I'm going to keep hitting some of these key principles and then see how it lands at the end of this. So if we look again, what are the risk factors aligning with an FASD? They are mental health disorders, which may very likely be the secondary characteristics that we just looked at. We're going to look at the alcohol and substance use disorders that are going to make the person in the short run feel better, but in the long run, only contribute more negatively. We're going to look at trauma and abuse, and we're going to look at it from that neurotrauma understanding of that environmental trauma. We're going to want to pay attention to the lack of social support that may have really exacerbated the issues of an FASD, and how we're going to create plans that will provide that for them. And we'll look at the bonding and attachment disorders that are really apart very, very much because of sensorial things, because of past exposures, what their own childhood is, but make all of these things that are huge challenges for those with injustice who are from the context of child welfare and have lost custody of their children, and the kinds of things that we know now really, really work with our parents with an FASD, and those things that really don't work. And again, within DCJ, in concert with working with parts of DHS, and in fact, some of it is the Indian Child Welfare Act, but also outside of that, for those folks who are not Native, we are finding we really do know what to do to support custodial reunification. And we also do know and understanding that there's sometimes that full-on custody is not going to be the safest option, but that we still can create the bonding and attachment that is so important. And so I will sort of digress to one other little story, and this was actually within the context of Multnomah County, of a woman who was not involved so much with justice, a couple of very small episodes, but really had a real challenge around addiction. And we cognitively and sensorially and in every way retailored the treatment interventions to meet her needs as a person with an FASD, and she was very successful. We worked to reunite her with her child. There were some of us who had some real concerns that she needed to be in a proctor home or in a supportive setting, and so we did that. And then DHS withdrew from that because she had been so successful for a year. I was still just visiting her because I was concerned. Not daily, but pretty much daily. Not because she was going to use, not because she was going to be abusive, but because of her tremendous challenge to her memory. And so I went by one evening on my way home from work, and as she was telling me that the next day was her daughter's birthday, she showed me some moccasins that she was making for her daughter. And I left and I went home. And the next morning I was wakened by a call at about 6:30 in the morning with the mother crying into the phone and sobbing. And she goes, "I think I've killed her, I've killed her." I was quite certain that that was nothing volitional, but I was quite concerned, and I knew that I was at least an hour away. So I needed to calm her down to learn what had happened. And this would seem like contraindicated, but if you think from a concrete perspective, what I did is I said, "Oh, tell me, how did the moccasins turn out?" And so that sort of diverted her from the sobbing for a second. She was able to say, "Well, that's the thing. I went to put them on her pillow, and she's not there. She's nowhere here. She's gone. She's gone." And so then I was able to say, "Did she come?" Because it was a summer evening. I said, "Did she come in and have dinner?" She goes, "I don't know." And I said, "Go open your door." And she was on the mat, the doormat, when she opened the door, asleep. Fortunately, it was a summer evening, but that was exactly the example that we needed to say. This is a mother who cares deeply. She loves her daughter loves her, but she is not safe. And so we really, part of what my hope with this a resolution is that we understand that in creating accountability and providing support in concert with each other, that we create the safety through understanding that our systems need to have a continuity of care. And it's not an either or. That kind of leads to the next slide, which is what are those protective factors that align with an FASD? And what can we do to support family and parenting and positive social support, cultural and spiritual practice, whatever those things are of a person's family, community, setting, assets that can support them. To do those, we really need to utilize that concept that comes from that next slide. which we talked about earlier, is I am my environment. If I have an FASD, I am my environment. That's what we mean by behavioral echolalia. My ability to predict what happens next, it's compromised. So when I go to jump off the rocky cliff, I'm sorry, I might have been speared by a stick the last time, even yesterday or even in the morning. But that doesn't help me remember it for the next. In the old days of first understanding FASD, we thought conscience was something that people impacted by fetal alcohol didn't have. But what we realized is using that principle of behavioral echolalia, that conscience is really, it's what you show me. That action, that good action, is what you script for me. And you script it by telling me what I've just done right, not what I've done wrong. Embed it in me, please, over and over, and show me what I've done right, because that's going to be my map. Because I don't, the next slide is, the seeming inability to learn from mistakes. I just can't, Sometimes I will learn some things, but my ability to store it and retrieve that, it isn't always accessible to me. And in part, the next slide is because I can't generalize from information. So if you go from that slide of generalizing, you look at the next one of the concrete processing. So you teach me in the daylight, which path, which road to go. That's good. And in that very same road, with those very same paths, with the very same signs, looking the same daylight, I will learn to do it because you've showed me. But if it's dark, it's not my street. Or if it's a different street, I don't know that. So it is, as so many people have said, it's like having a map of Portland and trying to drive in Seattle. Again, when we're working with folks, we have to look and consider everything from the context of behavior is communication. Because if we do, it isn't just that we're being compassionate and empathetic. If we really do, then we become the very good observers to understand why a person's behavior is. And more importantly, as we observe them and understand their history, then we will be able to create those plans and orders that will be effective. So please understand that I might present as extremely social. I mean, so many times as I'm sitting with probation officers and their clients are coming in, they've come in. I mean, yes, some seem depressed and sullen, but some, just social, But that doesn't mean that they are processing their environment. And as a child, you might observe me as being really cuddly, but then pretty soon you realize that I'm clinging, that I'm credulous. In other words, I'm, really gullible. I get confused. I might be compliant, but we don't know who I'm going to be compliant with. And yes, unless you've put me in that good, positive environment and really sewn that up. So as a child, what we see is that this brain-based behavior is really expressed in communicating, and that it's not necessarily willful defiance. It's not a behavior in that way. And one of the really important things, I think, is the next slide, especially for people within treatment and within justice, where we go, well, they're just going to have to hit bottom, and failure of teacher. Well, I'm not sure that it is ever, but I particularly is not with people who are of a very concrete nature. And I have had too many times in my life where that person has been told, and people have talked about, this person had to hit bottom, and where we find them is identifying them in the morgue. And I don't mean to be dramatic, but it's real, and we really need to stop using that as a criteria. And hopefully with, restorative justice and all of that, we have definitely have recognized and have moved forward. And which leads us to the next slide, which is identifying and reinforcing, as I keep saying, what's working. Concretely mapping the positive actions, scripting them, in other words, telling, actually literally scripting for an individual how to be, whether it's talking with a person in an interview, or what you're scripting for their structure and their calendar. And we need to use those. We need to really be mindful of those kinds of tools, and that we create those collaborative circles of care that are of a combination of community, family, providers together, within folks within the justice. And often justice will be that best place for integrating those systems of service delivery. And then the next slide is really, really critical. And actually, this gentleman, these are two people who gave me permission to use this slide. It's not from Oregon, but one is what we call a natural helper, community health worker, and the other someone who has, since he's in his mid-40s, and he has recently had 5, maybe 8 now, years of success for the first time in his life. And what has made a difference for him is that relationship that he's built from the folks with the people in his collaborative circles of care. But really, really what has worked for him and for so many of the stories I've been telling you is it's that frequency and duration of service that's understood to be essential to building and sustaining skills. So you use these CHWs, the CEWs, natural community helpers, mentors, and volunteer resources. And when we understand the importance, the absolutely critical importance of that frequency and duration of service, is that it's multiple contacts of shorter duration. So when I have an FASD, probably spending an hour with me is not that helpful. And in some cases, even a half hour. But if you could see me multiple times a week, and so we're starting to redesign court orders and probation visits and all in that context. So it's multiple times within a week. And then if we can also, in those programs and grants that are allowing CHWs to be a part of it, we're making it multiple contact. And in the case of one of the stories that I told earlier, what really turned the tide is we did 5 minutes time a day, 5 times a day within a community setting. And then, of course, we started to back off from that. But it's really understanding that frequency of contact. And I feel like one of the things that this current, landscape of the COVID-19 is doing is it has caused us to support clients only through phone calls. And so we are doing shorter calls, multiple times within a week. And the feedback that we've gotten, and in this one case, this one woman said, I have never felt more supported in my life than I have since we've been shut in, and she's in a shelter. I'm sorry, she's not in a shelter anymore. So yeah, that was part of our concern. But she was feeling really supported by those, and they're just like 5 to 10 minute calls every day. So that frequency is such a critical piece. And then the next slide is FASD produces a spectrum of impacts, and it's different in each person. So that's an important thing to remember. And that faces are not predictors of behavior. So let's help each other really remember we're not looking for faces to tell us the story, but rather we are being good observers of the behavior. And that we need to really understand that the folks that we're working to support, that their social cues are read through the face and body language of the people. So if you look angry towards me, or you have a scowl, then I probably don't think you like me, and my whole sensory and observation system has just shut down. But when you look interested in me and make me feel good about myself, I will. And a story that I have about that is about a therapist that worked with many of our clients, and then and they adored her, and they always showed up, even when they hadn't for others. But then she had a stroke, and her face was pulled differently. And even though they were concretely told, it became a real challenge to work with her because they couldn't concretely read, that very affable, friendly face. So that's an important thing to think of. So then we're going to go into some more specific just for justice personnel, which is to, start with that referring for assessment and diagnosis. Not only because it's an opportunity, but because it will make a difference in outcome. Assist arrested individuals in understanding court procedures. In other words, walk them through concretely scripting using these principles we've just talked about. Adapt the interviews process to fit those principles. Take opportunities to train courts and judges and assist with really appropriate sentencing guidelines. Train and use multiple opportunities to train corrections staff and probation officers and what those implications are, because when you do, the outcomes are very different. And the next slide is using the existing training tools in concert with the forensic screening tool. So, and these are some of the things that are the products of the American Bar Association resolution. So that next slide, the forensic assessment of FASD is, you look for it within that assessment, the offense conduct. And so what are those illogical actions with high detections of risk? The simple plan is only on the objective. There's no real exit strategy. It's impulsive and aggressive and overreaction to unforeseen events, the fight or flight. It's more sophisticated, and it's often coupled, whatever that conduct is often coupled with the more sophisticated or experienced co-defendants. In other words, so they're going to be doing that, as we said, to please someone else. And so then when you look to the next slide, which is that arrest conduct, quite often folks with an FASD will immediately or easily waive rights. They may over-confess and be quite suggestible. They will brag about their prowess or take full responsibility, even if they're co-defendants, because this is their opportunity, and again, they're not looking at the consequences, so they're going to admit to, because it makes them feel strong and good. They may very likely present with emotionally detached, as those are emotionally detached from crime, and so they, show little remorse or guilt. Again, they are in that moment. They aren't seeing what their consequences or even thinking of that person. Their behavioral regression, they'll break down in tears and often have some very infantile behavior. And then the next piece that, again, is part of what the resolution was wanting to really point out to people is that prior legal history shows that they are easily led by more sophisticated peers. They may have multiple low-grade offenses in teen years, often with co-defendants. Lots of stealing, it's in front of me, it's what I want. Actually, there is, again, a story of last week, or week before, where a woman, I was talking to her about the crime statistics, and she was talking about, she was one of the ones talking about the positive news, and I said, it seems like theft, property crime may be down, and she goes, well, now think about it, Susie. And I said, what? And she said, everybody's at home. But just that, what she and many have said is, if it's in front of me impulsively and I want it, then I'm going to take it. Or if it makes me look good to somebody else and I'm wanting to have them to think well of me, or because I need it for a variety of things. So theft is quite well represented within justice and FASD. There are illogical offenses, like the stealing of something with little value. Really oblivious. It looks like they're really oblivious to risk, impulsive, opportunistic, and then, of course, continual probation violations. And most typical of the data that we keep on that is just they never don't show up for, you have to really look at that scheduling, and that's why the frequency of appointments suggests much more success, because we are able to schedule it and have it with a frequency that is better memory retrieval. Within life history, and the ABA identifies that mom often is, we are known that mom abused alcohol and drugs, and so that's part of the assessment. There's involvement with child welfare, as I've mentioned. Adoption, foster, relative placements, juvenile commitment to services. Very often, in your historical review, you'll find special education and learning disabilities. You may find multiple diagnoses in childhood, especially ADD and ADHD. That history may also reveal rule-breaking behaviors, the lying, the cheating, the stealing, the fights, disrupted education or dropping out, substance abuse, unstable lifestyle, which of course can improve with structure. Then in terms of interview the client, the things that the assessment looks at is short stature, which is not always there, so we can't, but it can be one of those things. An unstable lifestyle, immature and naive, like some of the stories I've been telling, the eager to please or stubbornly resist the obvious, can't really provide a coherent, detailed narrative, and it won't be, sequential, as I mentioned before. Really difficult to concentrate, and that's when we also see a lot of the self-stimming and agitated behaviors. It doesn't add much to whatever if you ask me an open-ended question, I will get really stressed because I'm not answer it. If you say one thing to try to prompt me, as you might others, and you think that will start, sort of opening the story, that won't happen because of that concrete nature, again, of processing. Doesn't seem to remember what you tell them from one appointment to another. So I'm sure many people have expressed that. So the next slide just shows you the slide that were the authors of this assessment that we just kind of went through, okay? And we don't have to reread it because we just went through it in all of those slides. But that's what this slide is for. We use it within Department of Community Justice, most particularly within the Family Service Unit, and all the probation officers are using it, and then we revisit it as they become more familiar with the client, and that has really proved to be a very helpful tool. but it doesn't have to be limited just to probation officers. I also encourage, and we use it with prosecutors, public defenders, etc. So I offer that, and as I say again, this is one of those tools that is the outcome of the American Bar Association resolution. So then going to that next slide is just, again, some things that might give you some data around what you're looking for and what to think about with regard to FASD and justice. And so remember that the average age of an individual with an FASD who is in trouble with the law is 12.8 years. Which you might say, well, that's for a lot of our folks. Well, yes. Why might that be? You know. So part of what I'm hoping out of this little list to remember that I put in there was like, okay, in addition to this assessment, this is the data that's kind of come out again out of the ABA, and a number of us who've had the privilege of working with folks within the context of justice. This can help us look for and identify, just as the assessment does. Youth with an FASD are safer and more successful placed in juvenile systems rather than adult prisons. So that really comes out of what we learned from ballot measure 11 and its outcomes. And the numbers of, in particular, women over the years that I have had the privilege of supporting at Coffee Creek that entered underage, under 18, under ballot measure 11, and subsequently were identified or self-identified with an FASD who are begging to not be released because it's what they experienced for the first time in their life with structure. And they're afraid to leave. So that's one of the stories. The other stories are those who represent those folks who were put in prison and they just learned more egregious behaviors because of that echolalic behavior. Then the next piece is that 50% of individuals with an FASD have a history of jail, prison, or placement within psychiatric institutions. That is a statistic that reflects what happens with secondary characteristics when we have not used our knowledge, our awareness, or our budgets to address the needs of people with an FASD in childhood. And we have, conversely, we have a lot of really great data of what happens. In fact, the majority, I think it's something like 87% of individuals with an FASD who had early intervention and early support up to the age of 12 did not. No, I mean, well, they obviously, presumably it went on. But anyway, those who had early intervention have had supports early on. They don't end up in justice involvement. The next one is that nice word that you like. People with an FASD are more likely to engage in confabulation and make false confessions, as well as confabulation in a variety of ways. But that's one of the pieces of data that was important finding as preparations were made for the ABA. Attorneys may be successful in presenting a mitigating factor for creating alternative and diversionary sentencing and utilizing community placements as methodologies for concrete making of amends and accountability. And that's what I was alluding to earlier in terms of when we take the principles of understanding of the brain-based neuro behavior along with trauma, environmental behavior, we put them together, and we create very concrete scripting of making these amends. And again, you could almost use a whole training in doing that. Have some really successful outcomes. Court-ordered diagnosis and treatment that is cognitively aligned with and reflective of diagnosis are appropriate interventions, creating the most positive and successful outcomes. So again, that asking you to remember the importance of the positioning, how well positioned justice and corrections personnel are to set up a process that can have a really positive and successful outcome if we will help folks and their service providers identify who they are. And then, which leads to that next slide, which is, of creating those protocols of the court-ordered assessment and using diagnostic tools as soon as possible. Implement full functional assessments in concert with diagnosis for suspected offenders prior to sentencing, and if possible, immediately post-arrest and interview process. To cognitively retailor those interview protocols and language, and understand that behavioral training is not effective. In other words, a lot of the, CBT and all of that, that's not going to work because it will for many people. But if we understand the cognitive implications of fetal alcohol, we understand those approaches will largely not be effective. That we are adapting policies of risk assessment to more appropriate evaluative tools that do not focus on past history to predict future behavior. So that we look at, we really focus. It's important to have that history, and I've mentioned it throughout the course of this presentation. But it's also, and perhaps even more so important, critically important, to really to observe the current behaviors and do it all from a strength-based perspective. Focus on, and that's a lot of what what so many of the therapists who are working in concert with us, or those of us who are interventionists as therapists, are really, building those tools that are particular to that individual to predict future behavior. To focus on future pro-social behavior rather than past negative behaviors. In other words, looking for what individuals can do rather than what they can't do. Adapt language of the probation order to what they should do rather than what they should not do. In other words, it's actually almost like the old-fashioned early childhood preschool of, telling kids what to do. Tell them to walk, or not to run. And so for people with these kinds of organicity of brain development and challenges, it's that same thing. Is making sure that those probation orders, and that they're very concrete. Often I'm asked to review them, and what I realize is while they're really well-intentioned, they don't concretely script. For a person who has memory retrieval, processing, challenges, that's not going to work. So we need to really look at that concrete scripting of what to do. Then assess and determining the apparent use of an NCR defense and how. Because it isn't, again, it's not the one size, but what can be the appropriate use of that. Guidelines for use of conditional and alternative sentencing, which will include interventions with emotional regulatory approaches rather than cognitive behavioral training. So that's really hitting that same piece thing around CBT and all. Development of multidisciplinary team-generated client probation orders and work plans of integrated services, again, and over, you're hearing, from a strength-based, culturally appropriate, collaborative model, that utilizes, whether they're CHWs, natural helpers, etc., family and community assets, in concert, obviously in concert with the service providers and probation officers to provide the frequency and duration of contact that is really necessary for success. So we are sliding into the wrap-up, and I'm wanting to thank you, Jason, and anyone who has brought the interest and the time and attention to focus on this presentation. I really thank you for recognizing and knowing and wanting to know the signs of an FASD as they are expressed through, again, just in quick review, poor judgment, impulsiveness, inability to link or predict cause and effect, inability to identify dangerous situations, inability to anticipate consequences, people who may have much better expressive than receptive, so we kind of don't notice them, that will remember what we mean by literal and concrete thinking, will remember behavioral echolalia and sensorial reactiveness. And in closing, again, Jason, thank you so much for the privilege and opportunity to do this. And thank you to all of you who have been listening and looking at this, for caring and committing and considering the implications of FASD. And please know that I would be honored and pleased to follow up, because any presentation, whether in person or not, it is what it is, all stacked together. We may not have an FASD, but we all can be challenged with processing over time, and we think we heard or thought of something, and then we realize that there's, well, I don't understand. What are the implications of application, etc.? So to me, part of having the privilege of getting to do this presentation is also carrying the responsibility to follow through in any way that could be helpful to anyone who's been listening.